He says, he says, there's no recipe for finding the best theory that will adequately explain the observational phenomena. The process is rife with uncertainty, ambiguity, and subjectivity. Finding a workable theory is nothing at all like falling off a log, he tells us, right? Despite the countless possible theories that could fit the data, right?
Or the apple falling on your head.
Right. So he says all this makes science, success in science, a matter of an enormous amount of hard work, ingenuity, and creativity, and no small amount of luck. Scientists, he then says, are legitimate heroes, right? They are heroes. And it's their heroes. That's right. It's their hero status that seems to give them the credentials to be our final arbiters of truth. So when science speaks, as a result of this, people listen, right? Like that old commercial, right? Again, it's hard to argue, he says, with success. And so that's what he wants to look at in this particular chapter. In fact, the chapter is entitled Arguing with Success, right? He says, so when we hear that science and religion are at odds or even conflict with one another, right, it's all too easy to think, then so much the worst for religion, right? Because science is successful. Again, this line of reasoning, he says, is predicated on the success of science, right? So science is successful, and we know that. You know, it's hard work, but it is successful, and so we should listen to it. So if science is telling us something, especially about God and religion and that sort of thing, we need to pay attention and, you know, and go with it, is what he's suggesting here, right?
I mean, after all, we're talking to metallic objects that transmit our voice into electrical phenomena that then breaks it up into ones and zeros and somehow reproduces exactly, or pretty much with a small degree of certainty, what our voices sound like. And we're able to transmit it to the entire world. You take this technology, 500 years ago, and,
it would be like magic.
Yeah, it would be like magic. So there's that theory that advanced technology is just no different than magic for how it operates.
Yeah. So he talks about Stephen Hawking and Dawkins, and both of them, especially Dawkins, with his conflict analogy between reason or science and religion. Tries to make an argument about the existence of God as a result of the success of science. He says, now we can all agree that science works. All right, no brainer, just like you just said, the ones and zeros. He says, let's all agree for the moment now, so he's given some ground here, that our scientific theories really do provide significant evidence against God's existence. That is, he says, let us agree that science says or implies or proposes or suggests that naturalism is true, right? That there's no God. That's what naturalism says, right? Nature is all there is. There's no supernatural.
Right.
With such generous concessions, along with the undeniable fact that science works, do we now have a good argument to the effect that science has shown that God doesn't exist? All right, so what is the argument here? Well, we can kind of boil it down like this. Science works, right? That would be the first premise. And then science says that naturalism is true, or so says Dawkins, and folks like him, right? So if naturalism is true, then there is no God.
Right. By almost definition.
Right. Therefore, there is no God.
Yeah.
Right. So since science works or is successful, and it claims, according to some anyway, that naturalism is true, then that shows the success of science, he's saying, implies that God does not exist. Right? So that's what he wants to tackle in this chapter. And so, as we mentioned, the name of it is Arguing with Success. How do you argue with success? Well, that's what he wants to do in this chapter. He wants to argue with success, right?
In one of our conversations online with the awesome YouTube comments, that was a critique someone had, is, of course, you argue with outcomes. That's what you're given. Well, the problem with that, though, is sometimes, how do we provide food for 100 starving people? Well, you just kill 50 of them. Then what was starving for 100 is plentiful for 50.
Right.
Can't argue with success, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So
Success wins.
how do you actually measure what success is? And if we're trying to find a theoretically objective truth, that's what science is alluding to the fact to describe. How do we actually come about? How do we come about knowing what success?
Yeah,
really is?
and more importantly, at least for his argument here, is does success equate to truth?
Yeah,
right.
And it seems like our definition of success here is minimal as well too.
Yeah. So he says, so the question is, do we now have a good argument to the effect that science has shown that God doesn't exist? And he says, clearly not, right? We need at least one other important premise, namely that what science tells us about the physical world is true, right? In particular, those parts of science that are relevant to any argument leveled at belief in God.
So again, naturalism is this idea that nature is all that there is. What you see, touch, smell, those are the things that you can kind of seek out and represent. There's nothing like ghosts or goblins or space aliens or God. And therefore,
well, there may be space aliens, but they would have to be physical creatures,
right? They're a product of evolution or something that's not demons infesting the earth. So that's the worldview in which as some scientists, these scientists in particular, are looking at the world through. And so our claim is, when we tend to study these things, is why do we believe your worldview? So again, we're coming upon worldview questions. It's not just the sake of, well, science. Everyone agrees science works. We all think science is really nifty, and so what the scientists say, that's the gospel truth. And so if they say, well, all these things kind of bring up a cumulative case of no God, then it seems like there's no God, and so you kind of just throw up your hands and you're like, well, the people making the toasters and the electricity and the supercomputers, they're really smart, and so it's the Yuri Gagarin thing of I went out into space and I didn't see a God. Well, he was out in space, so he probably knows more than we do. So we're again having to understand that people look at the world through certain spectacles, through certain presuppositions and assumptions, and we have to understand that even scientists do this.
Yeah, good.